Good afternoon. We're covering the Southern Colonies and the Southern Colonies assignment. So we're beginning with Virginia, a broad overview, okay? So it had begun as an English claimed colony. Remember that it was inhabited by Native Americans, chiefly the Powhatan Confederacy. But it's claimed by England. England will come in 1607 and form Jamestown. Very tumultuous time, very tumultuous history. It's hard to avoid conflict history and covering it because there was a lot of fighting and competition and so forth between the indigenous Powhatan Confederacy and leader Powhatan and the leaders of Jamestown. But when they come in, they begin with a joint stock company. And remember, with a joint stock company, that is tied to number one of your argumentative assignment, that capitalism was beginning to evolve from mercantilism. So at this time, right, under the mercantilist climate of the early modern era, it's beginning to erode, arguably, primarily because of commerce connected to colonialism. Even if it was just commercial colonialism, like in the East Indies, etc., right? And into West Africa and into the Americas. And at this time, right, what kings and queens began doing is they began granting charters to private companies who would invest and risk their own necks, their own money into these joint stock companies to try to extract wealth. Profit was the name of the game. At this time, this coincides with the aggrandizement of the bourgeoisie, the people of the city, as a definitive class. An interesting book is Albion Seed by David Hackett Fisher on the different classes of England. If you're looking at that, it's called Albion Seed. It's a very interesting book if you had time and opportunity to look into it. But at any rate, it happens quite often in human history where you have the economic empowerment of a demographic. It's shortly followed very often by demands for political empowerment. And the people of the city, Bristol, Liverpool, London, they began wanting to have a stronger parliament, a stronger House of Commons, with more rights and opportunities for the common people, because they were not a part of the nobility, right? Remember, aristoi means the best. The aristocracy were those who had privileges, oftentimes were granted the monopolistic licenses from the crowns of Europe to engage alone in the most lucrative trades like tobacco, cocoa, sugar, cotton, and of course, slavery. So at any rate, as that's beginning to happen, right, you could come in by way of a joint stock company and you can volunteer your services if you have no money to put in. And you could be treated as such, as if you had put in services. So that's relevant to number one in your argumentative assignment. And with number one, right, you're looking at the fact that you have burgeoning opportunities for more people in America relative to England. And so again, you could come in, you could volunteer your services to try to go forward like a Spanish adelantado or an English discoverer, or these are all euphemisms, right? And well, adelantado was a legal title. But coming forth and claiming new territory, you could be granted minor noble status. You could be granted mainly more immediately some of the profits of whatever commodity that you tried to find and extract and exploit through commerce, right? So of course they looked for gold and tried to emulate the Spanish, and that didn't happen in the Chesapeake. And so the big moneymaker ends up becoming tobacco. So at any rate, they're in there and they're in that area. They're fighting with the Native American Powhatan Confederacy. And if you're in the midst of all of this, like John Smith, you can experience socioeconomic ascension, moving up the social and political and economic ladder. And so that's what some did, right? You also had a scarcity of labor and an abundance of land. You're going to have later on the squatters' rights, and you had something akin to that already, whereby you could go on land with that, especially with semi-nomadic tribes, land that was not occupied at the time, claim it for yourself, quote, improve it, cultivate the land, and be granted opportunities to gain it, sometimes even freely. And so you had those types of opportunities. According to multiple sources, wages were higher in Maryland and Virginia, etc., than they were back in England itself. And so people, it was supposed to, on paper, be a volitional process, could choose to become also indentured servants, to apprentice yourself to someone for 3 to 7 years, work primarily as an agricultural laborer, and at the termination of your tenure, you were to learn a skill, especially in Maryland. You will to have learned a skill, receive food, certain basic clothing and commodities, and also even possibly 50 acres of land at the end of your tenure. And so you have opportunities, right, opening in the Americas, in the southern colonies, that arguably may not have been there in land-scarce England and Scotland. Well, England and Scotland won't be united until 1707, so England. At any rate, let's see here, and you have some, you have some rags to riches stories. Thorogood, Spencer, Alsop, Wood, Menefee, Udi. These were some of the names that became well known for aspiring to wealth and achieving it from humble beginnings and circumstances. All right. However, as stated in here, there was an uglier face to it, right? If you already had money, if you already had wealth, if you were well connected back in England, you oftentimes had opportunities that were not afforded to other people. We're going to get into some examples of that very soon. All right. But with Jamestown, on number 2, what you're looking for is, you see the ugly English imperialist. He's out for his own primarily. Almost solely. He knows that he's not going to be welcomed, and he's coming anyway. He's defending himself. He's isolating himself, helping to create at least an environment of distrust with the Native Americans. You're going to see a lot of weakness and vulnerability on behalf of the Englishmen that come in to the sparsely populated Jamestown settlement in 1607, and they could have easily been wiped out by the Native American Powhatan leader, and for whatever reasons he chose not to. One being that he saw their cannons and their gunpowder, and he wanted to strike an alliance with them against his Monacan and other possible enemies, Native American tribal enemies. And so in hindsight, that may not have been the wisest of choices. In hindsight, he may have considered wiping them out while they were still weak and vulnerable, knowing the threat and the result that would happen within 100 years. Nevertheless, the ball was in his court, and that's known as agency in historiography. All right. So the proverbial ball was in his court, so to speak. So this is conflict history. This is traditional, or not traditional. This is revisionist history, whereby, kind of like Marxist history, those who lost are empathized with, those who won are vilified as the bad guys. All right. And so take a look at that. Then with number 3, court history of Jamestown. This is a very politically incorrect thesis by David Price, but I thought I'd show the other side of the spectrum, whereby he tries to justify that which the English did, show them as being vulnerable, their beginnings very precarious, and they faced anything but a meek sheep Native American confederation, as stated by Las Casas, right, his depiction of Native Americans. On the other hand, the Native Americans are depicted as being very shrewd, very cunning, very dangerous. And it took someone like John Smith, who was not like Edward Wingfield and Lord Ratcliffe and others, who pretty much had his position of leadership on account of his wealth and his family connections, but who, quote, earned his stripes as a proverbial American leader as opposed to an old world European leader, right? This is definitely court history, patriotic stuff, all right? So feel free to tear into it. But that's what you're looking at with number 3. And then with racism, I'm going to go back. We're not there yet. So with 1607, Jamestown, Powhatan War, 1610, 1622, the royal takeover, and now with the royal takeover, you have a royal governor, handpicked royal council, and a lower branch known as the Assembly of elected freemen. Oftentimes in the history of English political tradition, it was at least an aim to have like villages or districts of 100 to have one representative elected therefrom. But oftentimes you had to hold a freehold. You had to have about 50 acres of land even to be considered a participatory citizen or subject of England. That's a whole other thing we'll get into with the Constitution. Then you're going to have, right, Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, whereby many ex-indentured servants and African Americans and other demographics that were lower on the socioeconomic pyramid and occupied the Piedmont poor subsistence farming, right, growing your own food just to live area of Western Virginia, who are going to rise up and fight a war that they've been told not to against the Native Americans, whose territory, like the Doeg tribe and others, they were infringing upon. And when they did that, they were guilty of treason, and they thought, well, let's not finish it. Let's go ahead and just take that next step and take on the actual royal governor and the establishment on the East Coast. They felt as if, and this is a long theme in American history, new burgeoning communities on the periphery of states or colonies at this time are going to demand representation. They're going to demand that all the rights of subjectship, of citizenship, be granted to them. So namely, whatever their grievances are, they want them addressed. Whatever money that is taken from them by way of tax revenue, they want to see benefits from that given back to them in one way or another. And if not, they're going to complain and eventually, in multiple cases, actually rebel. And so it was almost successful in overturning the establishment in Virginia. And what do you know? Just about 1780, just 4 years after the rebellion, the beginning of the rebellion, you have a mass influx of African slaves. All right, to some people, that's not a coincidence. However, remember Lord Berkeley's hierarchy. So what began as kind of a pell-mell dash. Of course, you had the richest men of the Virginia Company sitting on the governing board. But other than that, you still had opportunities to try to strike out at land against the Native Americans, etc. Now, however, by the mid to late 1600s, people like Lord William Berkeley are trying to arguably bring forth the old establishment back in England, because many of them, like Berkeley, were from the gentry class, Gentry. And again, in David Hackett Fisher's book, very interesting, they were accustomed to having power, to having privilege, to having connections, etc., and to having other people do the manual labor for them in an agricultural venue. So at any rate, he and others were oftentimes younger sons, because the eldest son would inherit everything from wealthy dad. So the younger sons oftentimes took advantage of this, came over here, were afforded opportunities to sit in the royal council. You had endogamy, intermarriage between this ruling kind of clique, if you will. It's all found in the book, and it's found in your previous assignment on Spanish colonization in the very last number that says, were the English any better as far as having an inequitable society? So Lord Berkeley, that type of hierarchy was established by the late 1600s, and it really feeds historiography like Howard Zinn's, right? Conflict, Marxist history, quotes about fear of the unruly majority and who are poor. The vast majority of immigrants that come in are going to be indentured servants and poor. And then you have this wealthy elite who own the lion's share, who grow to own the lion's share of land in the tidewater best regions in the eastern part of Virginia. And so that all leads to the inequitable image of the South, the archaic backward image that goes through historiography of the Civil War and even beyond. All right, calling for a new South. So at any rate, cash crop production is going to take root, especially tobacco. So you see here, most of the 80 million pounds of tobacco by 1760 was cultivated in Virginia. And also quite a bit of that, what was remaining of that percentage was in Maryland. Speaking of Maryland, it began as a proprietary colony. And speaking about kind of archaic image, right, of like being old school, they went back to like the 1300s to the Palatinate form of government, where you have a manor system and almost feudal, right, whereby you had local leaders who could have their own courts, make their own laws as long as they didn't contravene those of Mother England, and have their own armies. Everyone who acquires land is basically just a tenant and kind of synonymous with a renter, because you had to pay quitrents, these medieval-like rent dues to the landowner, who was the chief kind of executive of the local area. So Maryland, it's going to have a chief ruler, right? It'll be the lords of Baltimore, the Calvert family. So you had George, you had Cecilius, and others. And so at any rate, feudal dues, sweeping powers. However, very quickly, I believe it was Cecilius, okayed the approbation, the approval of the people and their reps. He had that added. Arguably, he knew he was contending against Virginia and other areas for colonization and trying to attract those who were coming. Also note, he was a Roman Catholic. And at first, it looked as if he was going to establish a strictly the official religion of the colony, a Roman Catholic colony. Remember, this is going to happen with the royal colonies. They're going to be tied to the Anglican or English church, right? And so at any rate, that was more contested. But for whatever reasons, for multiple reasons probably, the Calvert family is going to share power with an elected representative body, as well as a body of well-to-do barons, handpicked by the governor. Okay, and so it was kind of an aristocratic republic, right? And they would be afforded the rights of Englishmen. And then let's see here, land estates, 2,000 acres for 5 servants. Wow, that certainly outdid the headright system, right? So an incentive to bring servants, you would be granted a lot of land for doing such, rewarded as such. So at any rate, you're going to have an inequitable base in Maryland as well when it came to land ownership. Okay, so there were about 60 manors throughout, but the manorial system is not going to last, as you can guess. So then you have the cultivation of tobacco that's going to economically revolutionize the country. Not to mention, right, with tobacco and other cash crops, is you're going to have people turn away from being content with subsistence farming, with just growing their own food and living off their own farm, right? But you've had, ambition, some would say greed, here in America, whereby people say, no, I want to make money. I want to make profit. I'm going to utilize as much of my soil as possible to engage in some type of cultivation of some commodity that will make me money, whereby I can buy whatever I want from it. So at any rate, indentured servitude, in the 1650s, it was supposedly the heyday of indentured servitude. You're going to have people like George Alsop and others who are going to try to speak highly of the indentured servitude system and claim, right, that it's the equivalent of today having a menial job, right, a job that doesn't have a lot of high prestige to it, not a lot of promises for advancement, not a lot of not a great salary, and you're doing it for the time being, but you're planning something much better, much bigger in your estimation. So for instance, working a menial job now and going to school, and just assuming, right, and expecting that you're not going to stay in that menial job for the rest of your life. So that was what indentured servitude was roughly likened to in the 1650s, and Maryland arguably at that time gave it a good name. Nevertheless, slavery, right? You're going to have about 160,000 slaves come in before the Revolutionary War, or the War for Independence. And while the majority of those 160,000 are going to go into Virginia, a decent proportion of that is going to go into Maryland as well. All right. And then Catholicism permitted Protestantism. 1642, there was a civil war back in England whereby King Charles I is literally going to lose his head, and the royalists are going to lose. And people here in the Americas took advantage of that. And so you had a gentleman who proved to be a thorn in the side of Maryland's governor, like a man named Claiborne. And they're going to try to topple his regime and say that it's Ensign regime, that it's pro-Charles I, and that it's disloyal to the parliamentary cause, the Roundhead cause, etc., etc. But they're going to last, the Calvert family, but again, on the basis of a large concession. They're going to grant political equality to Protestants. The governor is even going to hand over the governor position to a Protestant at one time, etc. All right. Then you also have the Carolinas, which again was a proprietor colony initially, held under 8 gentrymen. And the fundamental constitutions written by John Locke and others, again, aspired for an aristocratic republic. We're going to get into that more in detail when we do the Constitution. But there was the Albemarle County and another county. Albemarle was present-day North Carolina, the north of the Carolinas. And the other one, I apologize, I'm forgetting the name presently. I believe it starts with an S. Was the equivalent of South Carolina. So at any rate, in the Albemarle Northern County, it gained quasi or somewhat independence eventually. It will form into a separate state. Fur traders and Barbadians, they democratized the republic. They made demands, right? And oftentimes their demands seem to have been self-centered, short-sighted. But the argument is that it was for the good of the state, because it had a democratizing effect, and an empowering effect for the common people of the Carolinas. But the fact that Barbadians constituted a well-established kind of faction, if you will, right? A group of people that shared the same self-interest and ideology, etc. The Barbadians, they had a horrible reputation for how they treated their slaves and their slave codes in Barbados. And they're going to bring that over to the Carolinas. South Carolina in particular is going to develop a horrendous reputation for the treatment of its slaves. All right. The demise of proprietary government in the midst of the Yamasee War. And so they too, the Carolinas, are going to go under the royal jurisdiction. 9 of the 13 colonies will, by the time we have our War for Independence, be formally royal colonies. And slavery is going to take off with rice cultivation in the 1690s and indigo cultivation in the 1740s. So you see, by the eve of the War for Independence, 140,000 slaves have been brought into the Carolinas. All right. And then we're going to get into slavery soon here. And then in the 1730s, about 1733, Georgia under James Oglethorpe, he had utopian views, like creating this kind of panacea, this perfect place on earth, free of slavery, free of alcohol, free of avarice or greed, whereby he was going to limit how much land every person could have and try to do away with class warfare, and have kind of an Aristotle-like middle-class society in Georgia. And even one step further, he's going to grant that land in the first generation freely to debtors who were imprisoned back in England for inability to pay off their debts. But it's a long story, and basically he goes bankrupt, and it ends up failing. And so Georgia, as South Carolina, is going to develop a horrible reputation for the treatment of slaves, the existence of slavery, etc., and cash crop cultivation. Okay? Then we have in the 1700s, right? You're going to have an explosion in population. So you notice here only 25,000 in Virginia. That jumped to 350,000 in that 100-year time period. 10,000 in Maryland went to 160,000. 300 in North Carolina moved up to 1,200, right? But with that, you're going to develop hardened class differences and class divisions. Again, Howard Zinn's People's History of the U.S. gets into this. You're going to have the regulator movement. Again, a group of people in the western periphery, kind of like Bacon's Rebellion, felt as if their needs weren't being met by the Eastern established government, and engaged in civil disobedience. When that was felt not to have been sufficient, they armed themselves, and it turned into almost a class war, an East versus poor West war. But of course, it's going to fail. Almshouses, the development of almshouses are like gospel missions places, but they were oftentimes publicly funded, not just privately. But the almshouses provided food and lodging for the homeless, as well as trying to get them on their feet, teaching them different trades, and to try to get them, empower them to get a gainful employment, if you will. And ostentatious display of wealth and consumerism in the mid to late 1700s, that was rife, according to primary sources from that time period. And so this is all kind of relevant to the War for Independence that we'll get into after Test 1. Okay? Now moving back to the handout. Very controversial point. I'm not saying that it is necessarily my point, okay? I'm just throwing this as being thought provocative. But the thesis that slavery was an economic decision, not a racist one, okay? And you could likely guess where the data is going to go, right? The selection and organization of facts. It's going to lean toward demonstrating that first Native American, then white indentured servant, and other types of white labor were not sufficient, and even deemed to be unreliable after Bacon's Rebellion. And so then that's going to coincide chronologically around 1680 with the glut in the economy of slaves. And when you have many more of, let's face it, sadly, slaves were under Roman and Germanic law chattel property, no different from a horse or a plow, agricultural property. When you have property in abundance and not enough people and not high enough demand for the great number of that, the great quantity of that product, the price of that product is going to drop, right? So it thus ensued a case in which for a nominally higher price, so not much higher at all than buying an indentured servant for just 3 to 7 years who might rebel against you with high expectations, right? Now you could simply buy a slave for life and have access to that slave's children, especially when you get a woman, because Virginia and Maryland are going to write slave codes, and they're going to switch English common law from citizenship and subjectship, switching from the status of the father to that of the mother. And sadly, highly connected to that, a lot of people believe, was the fact that the lawmakers were very well aware of the fact that the many of the planters were forcing themselves sexually upon their female slaves and having biracial children from that. And they wanted to hold on to those slaves, and thus by making the children property of their status of their mother, who was a slave, so they can keep them. So at any rate, so look at the data, the hard data on this one, and let's see what you think. Okay, please feel free to disagree. Now note in this number, there is a concession that racism was existent, okay, but that it just wasn't the main catalyst, but that economics primarily catapulted the institutionalization of slavery, okay? So hence, right, going back to the handout, pardon me, Hugh Davis in 1630 was whipped with 30 lashes publicly for abusing himself to the dishonor of God by defiling his body and lying with a Negro, quote, woman. All right. John Punch ran away as a black man with 2 white indentured servants. The white indentured servants had 1 year added to their term and were whipped. John Punch was sentenced basically to life. Johnson versus Parker. John Kasser was the first to be sentenced to life on account of the color of his skin, right? Elizabeth Keyes won her independence, won her freedom because she had a white father. That was quickly switched within about 4 years to the 1662 matrilineal law in Virginia. Okay, in Maryland, when they were making their slave codes, they were concerned that English women, to the disgrace of our nation, do intermarry with Negro slaves, and that such constitutes shameful matches, in Balin's book. All right, and so at any rate, you have plenty of cases and evidence of racism being alive and well. And of course, you had promulgators of slavery, right? Those who actually pushed those ideas forward. You have here the Spanish jurist Alonso de Zuazo. You have Las Casas and others who contended that African people of sub-Saharan Africa were physically stronger and could endure the work more heartily than Native Americans and others could. So hence they should be sent to the mines. And then you had letters and protests from the Viceroy of Mexico asking the same thing, contending that the quote Negro slaves had a hardier constitution, were more quote robust, and could endure the work and ought to endure the work. But it got worse than that, right? Ibn Khaldun, right? He basically said that the Africans lived in bestial sloth, like animals, like pigs in the sty. You had Leo Africanus, you had George Best, and these others, right, who are going to promulgate what will later be called the Sambo image, S-A-M-B-O, the image of the happy-go-lucky, ignorant, animal-like, lacking self-control African-American man in particular. All right? And so no doubt that was all, existent throughout the early modern era. And by the way, if you'll indulge me, I want to encourage you, like I said, this is absolutely optional, but you have 2 books by Ibram Kendi. He's real popular right now. Kendi, Ibram, Ibram. You have Stamped from the Beginning, okay, with racist ideas and so forth. But I would make the contention, and I hope that I'm not making a false inference or an erroneous inference from this book, but I would make the contention that he still suggests economic motives behind these racist promulgators, all right? That it was very economically convenient to stereotype, to dehumanize sub-Saharan Africans, right? It was in their best economic interest. At any rate, you also have 400 Souls, his newer work, okay, an amalgamation of primary and secondary sources, all right? I would also recommend with the slave trade, looking at factors of getting England involved and getting them into the English colonies, etc. The Slave Trade by Hugh Thomas is a great book, okay, on that subject, as is David Breon Davis's In Human Bondage, okay? So just throwing it out there. Then the idea of racism being almost concocted, almost deliberately fomented, right? Because it had a divide and conquer effect in keeping black and white poor Americans from joining one another fraternizing with one another, rebelling with one another, right? The idea that it was conveniently promulgated is rather briefly, and I'm sure there are better sources on that one subject, but it's mentioned in Bernard Bailyn's The Barbarous Years as well. All right, evidence of that, suggesting that. So at any rate, the whole divide and conquer thing, the whole justification of slavery, the whole thesis is, right, is that deep down at its roots, it was an economically pragmatic decision. Obviously amoral. They weren't thinking about right and wrong and ethics, but it made practical economic sense as a more economic decision to utilize African slaves. And you had changes in West Africa itself, the opening up and the whether it was the empowerment of an empire like the Congolese, or the falling of an empire like the Songhai Empire. Even with the falling of an empire, there was so much disruption in the Tuareg and other invasions of nomadic peoples in Africa. It's going to create a lot of prisoners of war. And you're going to have the Dutch, the French, the English are going to just bully themselves into that trade, into the Senegambia and multiple other Niger and other rivers, and make deals with the local leaders to be able to acquire these slaves. And that, what do you know? They get an abundance of them in the Caribbean just at the time of Bacon's Rebellion, and it's going to drop the price of slaves and make them very cheap, affordable, and enticing option. So please, by all means, disagree with that. That is perfectly fine. All right. Then you also have South Carolina before it was a royal colony. The argument of African American agency, that they saw opportunities and took advantage of such opportunities when they arose, and namely the acute need for their labor. Look at instances of evidence for that, whether it be hunting, fighting, the shipbuilding industry, okay, etc., that they made demands as a demographic and received limited opportunities. All right. Number 6, the title says it all. Of course, slave conditions were awful. You had Kenneth Stamp early on show how awful slavery was, and people have largely run from that and used the same narrative of conflict history. I mean, how easy is it to do that? It's so obviously awful, and there was such suffering and oppression, and there's so much evidence for that. Some sources for that and for other things are Roll, Jordan, Roll by Eugene Genovese. All right. Runaway Slaves by Franklin and Sweninger. Okay. The Internal Enemy by Taylor. All right. And I have a couple others, but that'll do for now. But at any rate, just looking at this, right? Look for the way by which it's defended. This actually is a refutation, a challenge, right, to Fogel and Ingerman's book of Time on the Cross, stating that slavery was not that physically tough for slaves, that they received rich diets, that because they were expensive investments, their well-being was well kept and taken care of medically, etc. And they were rarely whipped and punished, etc., etc. So my goodness, where do you begin? How easy is it to argue against that thesis, right? So you have primary sources. The main piece of evidence, and it's probably not the strongest, but that you might find in this section, is evidence of desperate unhappiness on behalf of the slaves, right? Whether it came to passive aggression, breaking tools, working slowly, doing tasks wrongly, right? Hiding when it was work time, etc., to planning with the Stono Rebellion, planning an actual massacre of the master, of the overseer, of the family, of the local white population, right? That did happen. Um, Running away, absconding, running away with some property and taking it with you, acting defiantly. I mean, why would they put forth these laws if such things didn't happen, right? In the famous slave codes, the slave code stated that you couldn't lift your hand in defiance toward your master, that you could not poison your master with his food or drink, right? Other things that indicate that those things happened, right? On your third occasion of being caught running away off your plantation without the proper papers, you could be killed. You could be executed, right? You could not congregate in certain numbers, even if you were a, quote, free Negro, as according to the primary sources. You could not earn money on the side and renting out your services, as sometimes happened on the weekend, etc., if you lived especially in or near a major city, without your master's permission. Because the idea is you were going to gain enough money eventually to buy your freedom, which was known as manumission. So they circumscribed that as well. They made sure in the codes that conversion to Christianity did not guarantee you any political rights, much less freedom, okay, or protections. They stated very lenient terms as far as punishment or castigating your slaves, right? Even to the point of killing one of your slaves in the midst of punishing him or her, whipping, etc., right? Oftentimes, the very highest that I've read of was 5 years imprisoned, but it was almost never enforced. Okay, oftentimes it was a nominal fee that you had to pay, and that was it. But yet, if you were a slave, you even raised your hand against your master, you could be put to death. And so, very, very draconian rules in these slave codes. And in the South, French Louisiana was no better when it came to that respect. With the Code Noir, or however you say black in French. The Black Code in France was just as harsh. Okay? Let's see here. Oftentimes you find a phenomenon of the hated middleman. Someone who comes in, oftentimes a poor white man who never had such power, such opportunities to make money, and was given ultimatums. I want productivity at this level, and if not, you're fired. If so, you'll be recompensed handsomely. And so hence, it almost gave them the incentive to be very harsh toward the slaves on a day-to-day basis. And then, of course, with the hated middleman, the master can play the diffident, the aloof boss who was ignorant of how hateful his middleman was, and at times could even fire him and replace him with someone else to keep down sentiment, keep down anger amongst the slaves. All right. And yes, you have people like Fitzhugh and other writers later on who are going to contend that they treated the slaves well because it was in their best interest. They didn't want trouble. They didn't want rebellion. So they gave them ways of escape. They let them have their dances. They let them have their own religious rituals. They let them file their teeth, name their kids African names, and do things to carry on pride in their African heritage. But they also separated tribes, the Yoruba, the Igbo, the Dahomey and others. They oftentimes wanted them divided and conquered. They didn't want them being able to speak the same language, the same culture, have familiarity with one another. They wanted to keep them separated. They didn't let them go together in too large of numbers, even at funerals. And also, Fitzhugh boasted that when there were brutal masters, that there was great public scorn toward those masters. Okay, that's great, but what about the those who experienced the atrocities on behalf of those masters, right? The poor slaves, that people shunned them socially. I don't think the slaves' family members would find that to be adequate justice. So at any rate, you have plenty of evidence of slaves risking their very lives to run away, to rebel, and in indirect and overt ways, etc. You have evidence also skeletal remains of muscular and skeletal damage from heavy labor. All right, they can discern the difference between that and something like, osteoporosis or something of that sort. They know when it's from extraneous labor. All right, and then number 7, agency with the French. Just look for evidence of the French not bringing enough resources here, not enough men and women, not enough soldiers, not enough commodities and goods, not enough just numbers, right? To be able to impose their will here in North America. So hence we're speaking English now and not French, as the English defeated the French in colonizing North America from the Native Americans. And so look for evidence of the Native Americans, right, using their agency, and if anything, bullying the French. Okay, I'd like to know what you think of that, should you choose that one. And then lastly, right, French Louisiana, fluid but by accident, contending, right, unintended consequences and American exceptionalism. That French Louisiana became a land of relative fluidity. People could relatively marry whom they wanted, do what they wanted for a living, but that was not the intention of the French authorities when they got here and when they colonized Louisiana. Okay, 1718, I believe, was the year that New Orleans was established. And so look for evidence as to why, how that argument is conveyed. Then what happened? If the authorities didn't want it to happen, how did it happen? Okay, look into that. I know you could discern it yourself. All right. So please read all of these, all right? And please choose one to analyze and evaluate. And I believe that covers everything for the test. I'll put this PowerPoint up as well. You guys have a great day. Good luck with everything. Thank you.